I do. Test, test, test. Okay, can you guys hear me okay this way? Everybody can hear me? Can you guys hear me back there? Session? Like right now, I want to tell you that we are doing this, so because of that, I'm doing a couple things that are a little more detailed than we know. This is supposed to be important because us talking one-on-one. Okay, now this is the official start. And I wanted to thank everybody for coming. We're at the Quaker Meeting House in West Hartford. We're celebrating the life of Timothy Zielenbach. Today we're gathered to remember Tim, to laugh, share stories, share moments, and talk about our friend and how he touched our lives. First of all, I do want to start with a moment of silence in remembrance of Tim. Thank you. It's so glad to see Tim's father, Bill Zielenbach, here. So great to see Meredith here. It's so great to see a lot of his good friends. Tim had a lot of close friends who he talked about often. Today, many of those friends are going to come up and give you stories about Tim and how he touched their lives. First of all, and we will go through some photographs as people speak. Some of these are taken by other photographers other than me, but the ones that are different, I'll acknowledge, and we can have them going as people speak. And first up will be Patrick Woody, who's a very good friend of Tim's, helped him out on several shoots in the last couple of years, and did the last shoot with Tim. So we are starting out with Patrick Woody.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Brad. And thanks for putting this together. It's really good to see everybody. It's hard to be here, but I'm happy about it. Someone asked me yesterday exactly when I met Tim, and I don't know. It was in the mid-90s. We were both in college. Tim was in Indiana. I was at Western Kentucky. And this was pre-email, everybody. So when you met somebody, you had to meet them in real life. I think it was probably at like a short course or Atlanta or a Northern short course. I'm sure we sized each other up just like every photographer does. Were you interning? What kind of awards have you won? Did you enter CPOI? Do anything in Hearst? You know, that kind of back and forth. Tim and I both did a one-year contract gig at the Chicago Tribune. Tim was first, and I left some really big shoes to fill. It was tough. And that shared experience and the shared disappointment that we didn't land staff jobs afterwards solidified our bond, and we still complain about that, but we did complain about that. Tim eventually took off to Africa, building a life and career as a freelance photojournalist that many only dream of. I was envious, jealous, really. He was living the dream, hustling international magazine assignments, landing the cover of the New York Times Magazine. And then he was in the first ever World Press Jupe Swart Masterclass. That's jealousy. Then he won a World Press Award in 2000 for this epic photo from King Hussein's funeral in Jordan. Us back in the States were just like, Tim. And we kept in touch over the years, like a lot of us do. A few emails, a call, and then silence for a couple of years. We got married, we had kids, we got divorced. Then in 2018, my entire world collapsed in a very public way. Tim was one of the very few people who reached out. He told me that he'd never forgotten that I'd done the same for him years earlier after he was carjacked in South Africa. I made some profound changes in my life. I stopped drinking, started going to AA. Tim shared with me he had just celebrated 10 years of sobriety. I was inspired. And Tim was there for me when many were not. When others drifted away, Tim stayed steady, unwavering, exactly when I needed it most. And then Tim got me back on my feet in a lot of ways. You know, he'd bring me on to shoot these big fancy weddings with him, not as an assistant, but as a colleague. And he insisted on that designation and would go ballistic if someone referred to me as his assistant. Pat, oh, and also Tim called me Pat, which, and now Meredith does and Bill does, and you do actually, and I don't mind. Yeah, see, Caroline knows. But no one else does. I have one sister that does, and Tim, and it's sweet to hear it because I'm not used to it at all. But he would say Pat is my colleague, is not an assistant, which I thought was really sweet. I don't know. It was one of those little details about Tim that's really hard to pinpoint what made him Tim, but that was one of them. He was one of the hardest workers I've ever known. I was talking about this, Clark, you know this, yesterday, that we would qualify the weather and the kind of wedding it was based on how many shirts that he sweat through. And you know, he'd still shoot weddings without me, and I'd be like, "So how was it, man? How was the wedding?" And he's like, "It was an 8-shirt day." And I'm like, 8 shirts the dude sweat through. It's really gross, but that's Tim. Hey, whatever. And he would work so hard and go the extra mile. I'd give him a hard time. I'd be like, dude, like dial it back, man. You don't have to lay in the sand for these people. Like on the beach with the bride and groom, I'm holding the stick with the flash on it next to them, and he's laying on the ground. And I'm like, oh my God, he's laying on the ground. Tim, don't. And then he'd stand up and be covered in sand. And then we would always do this picture with the bride after of Tim like standing there in the sand, covered in sand. And one I got, Bill, I've got to send it to you. It's a picture of Bill. It's a picture of Tim and Josh. Josh assisted us once, which was hilarious. Oh my God. He's a little Tim, said a lot of inappropriate things. I told you that. But I love that. It was like, this is, I don't know, this is him. Like I said, I told him you don't have to lay in the sand, but he always did, because that's the angle he wanted. He wanted the background clean. He was a tight and bright photographer. So I'll get to that in a second. So this last wedding Tim and I did, it was August 16th, and might have been the 17th. And Tim died on August 28th. So at that wedding, to be there with him was special, you know. And I want to share this. What a bride wrote me, which is I've never had anyone say anything about this about me. And this is a bride. This is someone that's paying him to be there on the most important day of her life. And we were documenting it. That's funny. So after she heard the news about Tim, she reached out. She sent me an email. This is it. I wanted to share my own condolences for the loss of your brilliant, energetic, and hilarious photography partner, Tim. She didn't call him my boss. That's pretty funny. I knew him only briefly, but it is no exaggeration to say that sharing those hours with him on the morning of my wedding, while I had my hair and makeup done, was the highlight of that morning. He kept me from going over the cliff. He squeezed my hand at several points and stopped taking pictures to remind me of what mattered was my marriage and my love for Lewis, not how far behind we were on the timeline. He made me laugh when I otherwise might have burst into tears at several points, and his photographs of that day are a memento I'll treasure for a lifetime. I loved reading that. And this last wedding, I don't know, we had a really cool way. And Andrew, I know you've worked with him a couple times, and he loved your work, by the way, man. Like, I felt like I was trying to fill your shoes at that point. But how we kind of worked around each other was like this cool little dance of, I'm not going to get in your way. You're not going to get in mine. And without even really communicating, we knew how to do that with each other. And it was really cool. But looking back now, I can't imagine what he must have been feeling inside or thinking, but to be able to hold it together like that and perform and make good pictures and be there for other people when I don't know, it's almost like he wasn't fully there for himself or something. I don't know. It was rough, looking back now, especially. But he drove me to the airport. I mean, he drove me to the airport and he always picked me up. Like, that's something. That's friendship. You wouldn't do that for me, Eris. I'm just kidding, man. So Tim dropped me off at the airport. And as we were saying goodbye, I handed him a 17-year sobriety chip. And he got emotional. And I've seen him get emotional before, but it was a heavy emotion. And he took the chip and he gave me this huge Tim bear hug. And I mean, like, if you've been hugged by Tim, there's a Tim hug, and it was that. And that was the last time I saw him. A little over a week after he died, I got some packages from Tim. And inside one of those was a letter, and inside the letter was the coin that I'd given him. And he said, hang on to this for me. And I know what he means. Tim's going to be missed by his photographer family around the globe, especially me. I'm going to miss his encyclopedic knowledge of photography and his quippy commentary on photos we'd see, on the New York Times or wherever. I'd get these texts out of nowhere. A 16, 24, that'd been better with a 50 or 70, definitely better. That's it. And I don't even know what he's talking about. Or we'd be talking about another picture and he'd say, it'd be nice for there to be a true white. Photographers will know what I'm talking about. Another text I found by scrolling through, the color looks bathed in urine. Sounds like Tim. And then, and also he'd watch things live on TV, and as they were happening, as if I was there watching it with him. we were watching the DNC, and during Kamala's speech, he wrote, "Whoever is using strobes is an idiot." She was just getting blasted, and but most of all, I'm going to miss this friendship. And I'll close. My brother died in July, and he had cancer, and Tim left me this voicemail, and I should have picked up, but I was like, man, I don't want to talk to anybody right now because it'd just been the day before, I think. So Tim left a message, which I'm so grateful for now because I have it forever. And he was emotional, and he said, "I'm very, very sorry to hear about your brother. I'm glad to hear your response that he's in a better place. No pain. I love you, Pat. He may be your biological brother, but you're my actual in real life brother. And I just wanted to let you know that. And I love you very much." Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Patrick. I have a note here from another friend. It's brief. Yeah, actually, that's Patrick right there. I think that might be you in the background. I think that's you. Yeah. What's that? No, I think it's just a camera. We all went outside because there was a full moon. A lot of us who were here were there that day. I'm not sure why you were in the wheelchair. We talked about it last night. I still don't know why you were in the wheelchair. Okay. Yeah. I hope there's no video. This the back in the olden days. Anyway, this is from Paul Giroux, who was a friend of his for many years, and they were so close they had their own language. They had this camaraderie and just a great time together. And I would get together with them sometimes in Washington or even in Chicago, and I wouldn't understand what the heck they were talking about. I mean, Tim and I had different characters, fake ones in our lives, but these guys spoke a language of humor that very few people knew. And he wanted me to just read a quick letter. By the way, all those photos that were back there were all by Paul Giroux, including this one of one of the best days that Patrick ever had. And Paul Giroux, who, like I said, was the official photographer, right? Dear Tim, Paul says, I will miss our chats, our snarky stories, and sharing imitations of friends and foes alike. Your wit was razor sharp, your ear true, and your infectious laugh would fill a room and make me smile. When I met you at the Democratic Convention in 1996 in Chicago, I instantly liked you and knew you would be a friend. You had that way with people. You will be missed by your family, your friends, and I want to thank you for inviting me to your wedding on the most gorgeous autumn weekend in October 2000. Hence the pictures. I met Nikki at your wedding. We were later married, and it changed the course of our lives forever and for the better. I didn't know what I had been missing by not being a husband and a dad. And because of your wedding, I would become both. I don't know if I ever told you, but thank you. Or as we might say in our imitation banter, listen, man, thank you. Thank you. Thank you again. Sorry, it's an inside joke between Tim and Paul. Rest in peace, my friend. I will miss you and am eternally grateful for all you gave to me and my family. Paul. Hard to follow, but Eris Economopoulos will, and he's next to talk about his relationship with him.
I'm fine. So, Tim and I were the same age and both young photojournalists. And I met him in 1995. I was a really, say, troubled college student photographer. Um, Graduated with a 2.4 and barely graduated and didn't really have a lot of confidence. And I started getting some internships and some more experience. And I interned at a newspaper in Biddeford, Maine, a small little paper. And my boss, Chris Asaf, happened to be really good friends with Tim. And this internship actually was the first time I really started gaining confidence as a photographer and did rather well there. So the internship ended May 95, and I believe it's June-ish, and they had the annual Pictures of the Year award celebration in Washington. And I grew up in suburban DC, so invited Chris to stay at my parents' house with me, and we go. And during the day, they had amazing lectures by these world award-winning photographers, Mr. Crystal Eagle, and it was really inspiring, but also I was really depressed. I felt like an imposter. I shouldn't be here. Also, I felt really jealous because I was just working at a 14,000 small town in Maine newspaper, and they had amazing pictures from all over the world, from conflict to exotic places, and I just didn't have that opportunity. And so I was kind of bitter in a pissy ass mood. Okay. And you're surrounded by, the best of the best, including Washington Post, National Geographic, everybody there. And so I was kind of fickle. And so the day portion was over, and back then it was a lot more formal celebration. That evening, be cocktail parties, and so we decided to go back to my parents' house to change to get a suit on, and I met Tim through Chris there, and you're more welcome to come back to my parents' house and change with us. So we take the metro, and my mom picks us up at the metro station. And mom asked how it is, and she actually loved me being a journalist, loved the idea of being a photographer, but also my grandfather was a sculptor, so you had an art. And so she was very on hand and talking to me, asking me about it. And I didn't want to have this conversation. I was just really obnoxious. And I was like, well, mom's like, oh, if you could get in the community and find these great stories, whatever. And I'm like, nobody wants that. Whatever. You need a budget. You need to travel. And I was being a little bit of a jerk. Okay. So we go back to my parents' house, and I finish changing in my bedroom, and Chris and Tim are changing in one of the other bedrooms. And I walk in, and remember, I'd only met Tim for a couple hours. And when I walk in, Tim's back is to me, and he says to Chris, his mom's a better journalist than he is. I'm like, what the? Okay, this is awkward. So, sure, okay. And I was Chris's intern, and I had done really well. So I was like Chris's proud poster child and everything. And I'm like, okay, fine. So we let it go, and we go back to the POI, the celebration, and a lot of libations. The best is when I had grown up, nobody knew me in Maine, and for some reason I decided I grew up my hair to my shoulders. I was a hippie, I guess, And Chris had interned at Agency France Press, and Mike Sargent, his boss, was there, and he had his hair all slicked back. And Tim and Chris were drunk as hell, and they asked Mike, hey, what grease do you use so Ferreras to put in his hair? And I'm just like, oh my God. And we had a fun night, and we let, like what Patrick was saying, you're looking at these people. Are they my competition? Are they my friends? And you realize that all those silly insecurities you just let go. And you actually celebrated each other, and you can still be successful and still strive, but be each other's biggest cheerleader. And that's what Tim was. And he wasn't shy. And the thing is that he was 100% correct. My mom was better journalist. I was just a whiny little bitch, I guess. I don't know. So with that, we had a good friendship, and we kept in touch through the years. I took a job in Jasper, Indiana, a small town just south of Bloomington, where he went to college. And he recommended good places at, Indiana to go hang out and everything like that. And we started having successes both in our career. I won an award in World Press, and then he won a couple years later. And I'm encouraging him and also telling him about Amsterdam. And so we had this nice parallel, and we kept in touch, but we weren't like the best buddies. We didn't talk every day, by no means, but we had this really care about each other, and became each other's cheerleaders. And Tim was honest, and sometimes brutally honest, and I think you needed that in a friend. Then I took a job in New Jersey. I was living in Jersey City, where actually I live now. At the time, I was living right by the waterfront. And on September 11th, actually that day started, my mom woke me up, and I was hungover, and I was pissed off. Why are you calling me? Half hour later, phone call from my editor, planning the tower. I went over, I photographed that day. I was across the North Tower when it fell. I was severely injured and almost died that day. And he was one of the first people to reach out to me to see if I was all right. And that really meant a lot to me. And, dealing with trauma, and we talked about it. It was, and you think you're fine, but PTSD is like flipping a switch. As photographers, we are talented and trained to focus on the composition, the moment, and put that trauma aside. The problem is flipping that switch back. And it's really hard for somebody who's never been there to understand that. Like, you have an anxiety attack, and just breathing's a challenge. Oh, just stop being silly. And Tim was very supportive of that. And I didn't even realize that morning he was there also with Brad. And then afterwards, I gradually, my eyesight came back, and he was very, supportive, and, his experiences in South Africa and relating to that. So we still kept in touch, and on and off through the years. And we went to his wedding, which was a very funny, silly, wild night, from what I remember. But there are some pictures. But then I went through a divorce, and he was also very sympathetic as we were each other, and that's very traumatic. I was in a really dark place, and it was a dark apartment, and a number of my friends had left Manhattan, and then, my wife's friend. So I felt very alone, and I forced myself. So of all places, I went to Coney Island, and it was just a beautiful place. Nobody cares who you are, where you are. And it was my therapy. And I met people, and I started photographing there, and about 10 years of pictures. And just this year, I'm like, yeah, and he's like, when's the book coming out? I'm like, well, finances and everything, I got to edit. And I just have a folder of over 2,000 pictures. He's like, well, I want to see it. I want to see it. I'm like, I'm kind of very cautious of what I share and everything. Somehow he just could convince you. And so I sent him about 250 select photos, and he did a mock book. And it was really interesting. And it was really interesting for somebody to interpret my work with a fresh eye, but also very honest, and he actually wrote a critique of the stuff. Patrick read it yesterday, and I agree with some of the stuff. I disagreed with it though, but I like that he was able to trust and feel comfortable being honest with me, and that's what you want. So that was you know, very important. And you know, it was just a couple months ago when he sent that. Also, and Patrick alluded to it, when he was having a really hard time, Tim called me and he was very concerned about Patrick, as I was. And I think that's really when you find out who's your friend. And for somebody who's battled depression all throughout even high school, um, you know, that was really important. And, you know, I checked in with Patrick and Tim did also. And that really meant a lot. And this past May, my mom passed away from cancer. And he texted me. And he's, you know, and it's actually the last time we talked. And, you know, I'd always planned for him to talk to him. And, you know, he says, I'm not much of a praying man, but you and mom have been on my mind. We may not be super, super close, but I like to respect you and respect you a great deal and hope you are able to process your grief and find as much peace as possible. Thank you. And then I said, writes, sending a big bear hug your way. And I just remember his voice, this big booming voice and bear hug. Then a completely different tangent, great access on the former president's plane, on Trump's plane. So, but he was a very loving, caring, there wasn't anything fake about him. I mean, he would be in your face, which is good and maybe bad, who knows? But more importantly was he was there for you. And it's amazing. When the first time we met, we got past the silly insecurities and competition and realized that we were so much alike and that we just loved and cared about each other.
Thank you, Eris. That was great. And we now want to hear a word or two from Andrew. If you'll come up and say a word about your knowledge of Tim. I'll take that. You take.
It is. It's way too wide. Tim would not approve. So I first met Tim in 2003 at the Northern Shore course in Jersey City as a photography student at Rochester Institute of Technology. My portfolio was filled with images from South Africa and Botswana, and we connected instantly over those photos. Tim had spent time living in South Africa and working around Africa. That and the fact that we were both from Connecticut created an intimate or immediate bond. Unlike other reviewers who tore my work apart, which it deserved, Tim embraced it. He saw something in me when others didn't. And at a moment when I was questioning my future in photography, his belief in me meant everything. From the beginning, Tim always asked, "What's the story?" That question became the cornerstone of how I approach photography, and I still ask myself that today. As the years passed, I continued traveling the world, working on documentary projects and developing my vision, and in the background was Tim pushing me, supporting me. What's the story, he'd ask, and the occasional, "How in the hell did you see this?" Or if you really want Tim lingo, "Praise mighty Allah, that's a hell of a frame." Or as time went further on, "That is pointy," if you know anything about him. In 2004, after transferring to Western Kentucky, our relationship deepened. Tim wasn't just a mentor anymore, he became a true friend. In 2005, I got an email from him, short and to the point: get down to Atlanta this weekend. It was the Atlanta Photojournalism Conference, and when I arrived, there was Tim in the middle of everything, introducing me to people I only knew by name. Tim was a connector, pushing me to show others my work, and people gravitated around him. Despite the distance, Tim continued to push me. He introduced me to more photographers, encouraged me to apply for internships, and never let me get too comfortable. The pile of rejection letters turned into successes, and Tim was there every step of the way. He'd reach out what feels daily when I was interning at National Geographic magazine and the New York Times, offering advice as well as truly caring how the experience was. Tim was always guiding me as I lived out my dream of working at the highest levels in photojournalism. In 2009, I moved to Abu Dhabi for my only full-time job in photojournalism. It was my first time living overseas, and again, Tim was there for me. He'd been through it before, working in the Middle East and Africa, and he offered guidance as I navigated that experience. But when I transitioned out of the field in 2012, I finally understood just how hard that change was. Tim had already made that transition, and he helped me through mine, especially when I struggled to let go. When my oldest son, August, was born in 2011 in the United Arab Emirates, I found myself in a dangerous situation, covering Egypt's revolution, in Tahrir Square, when I was attacked by a mob. It wasn't until then that I truly understand what Tim had been preparing me for all those years. He had been in similar life-threatening situation in South Africa that made him reevaluate everything. It took my 3-week-old son for me to realize that sometimes the dream isn't worth it. Tim was there for me that day and in the months and years after that. He understood how hard it was to leave photojournalism, and although our paths were different, our endings were similar. Tim was there for every phase of my life. When I decided to leave photojournalism and transition into weddings, it was Tim who made that possible. I moved back to the US with no direction, a 1-year-old son, and a wife, all while feeling incredibly lost. Tim invited me to Georgia, allowing me to build my wedding portfolio, offering a place to stay on those weekends and earn a living while launching a photography business. I photographed weddings all over Georgia, and there I saw Tim in action for the first time. Tim worked like a madman. There was no off switch. A 3-hour rehearsal party turned into 7 hours of shooting, and if you photograph with Tim, you know what I mean. You'd inevitably end up being his Sherpa hauling extra polo shirts and pants from his Volvo, because by then he'd sweat through the 3 he was carrying with him. Tim left nothing to chance. He could be tough on assistants, but he never treated me poorly. He always saw me as an equal. Through those years, I had the pleasure of getting to know his boys and seeing how to be a great dad. By that point, I had my second son, Orion, and I could see the life ahead of me through his. I traveled to Charleston with him several times for weddings, and there were always late night steak and fries dinners at his favorite French restaurant, which I wish I remembered the name of. It was always way too late to be eating dinner because of how overboard Tim got photographing. Our relationship became professional, but he remained an older brother and mentor to me. Tim was not without his quirks. In the little downtime we had, all we do is watch The Dictator by Sacha Baron Cohen, or whatever other stupid movies he's made. I swear Tim had seen all of them at least 100 times. We'd send each other texts quoting it, and when we weren't doing that, sending one another's selfies with stuffed animal sharks on our head, joking about entering them in photography competitions. Because let's be real, has a shark on somebody's head in Mogadishu Never won POY or World Press? Both. These were our inside jokes, but most of all, we talk photography like no one else. Tim was an encyclopedia of photographers and photographs and instilled that in me. That said, Tim wasn't always a fan of the photographers I admired. They were a little too out there for him, but that conversation usually led back to me arguing the great vision and storytelling by the photographer. And God forbid a picture was shot with a 16mm lens that made the front page of a newspaper. Both of us would lose it because I'm sorry to offend anyone here, but no one's really done it effectively. Sorry, Brad. And I will mention the two of us never figured out the esoteric nonsense that some people passed off as documentary photography and photojournalism. Tim was a giver. He was always thinking of his friends. If you were going through a tough time, Tim was there no matter what. I get random packages from him, usually photo books I didn't have. I wasn't the only one. He'd send me pictures of him with his boys all the time. The most memorable one was the time he sent me a selfie with his boys and James Noctway. I don't know if anybody else ever received that one. That's just who Tim was, thoughtful and always sharing. Now that Tim is gone, I can truly say he shaped me into who I am today. I met him when I was new to photography, and he mentored me every step of the way, from those early days to the career I have now. Our friendship ebbed and flowed over the years, but his influence was always there. From seeing how hard Tim worked firsthand, I can say that's why I photograph the way I do. I'm always hunting, always dancing with my cameras, asking myself, what's the story? And striving to create images I could be proud of. Even in the absence of our conversations, Tim has always been a force in my life for the better. Without him, my life wouldn't be the same. Because of his impact, I'll continue to push my photography, my vision, and how I see the world, because that's what Tim would do. I do wish I could have been there for Tim the way he was always there for me. That's my regret. But I know Tim would be proud of the person he helped me become, shortcomings and all. Our lives were so similar in so many ways, and I owe so much of mine to him.
Very nice. Thank you, Andrew. That was great. And what's great about the eclectic group we have here is that we have so many different stories to tell different stories about Tim and the breadth of his time here as our friend. Meredith, could you come up and say as much as you'd like to say? But we have 3 minutes left. I'm just kidding. Joking. I'm joking.
I know you are. Hi, I'm Meredith, and I am Tim's partner, and I've known Tim for quite many years. Well, let's start here. I met Tim when I happened to bump into him in a hallway in the stairwell of Kingswood Oxford School. And I saw this handsome man, and I saw him talking to Mr. Cayley, and he was the photography teacher. And I said, "Ooh, who is that?" So I stopped and waited for their conversation to end. And I grabbed his attention. I said, "Excuse me, are you Tim Zielenbach?" And he said, "Why, yes, I am." And I said, "Wonderful." And that, everyone, was the start of our 33-year love story. Tim marked many firsts for me in my life. First kiss, first dance, first kiss, first love, first heartbreak. I met Tim in the early 1990s as he began college and began his burgeoning interest in becoming a conflict photographer. I remember when he arrived to pick me up for our first date, Tim dutifully submitted to the parental interview. And my mother said, "War photography? Really? Why not wedding photography?" Tim, he saw that and he heard it as not as a compliment, but as a, how could anyone not want me to become the next James Noctway or David Burnett or Robert Capa? How could I not do that? Well, spoiler alert, as you most know, Tim did become a wedding photographer. Tim was funny, charming, and disarming. He also had He also truly shared his honest emotional self with the people in his life. You neither had to wonder what or how Tim felt and thought about you because he told you repeatedly. The intensity of Tim's emotions made all of us get swept up with him just a little bit. Whenever he would tell us a story, we all bought the ticket and took the ride with him. And it's a wonderful gift because he made us all feel more, because he lived his excitement so vividly, intensely, and externally. Anyone who spent time with him, hanging out with Tim, could tell you a funny story, recite one of his frequently quoted lines, tell you that Bruce Springsteen, the New Jersey poet, created the soundtrack to Tim's inner monologue. As a matter of fact, Tim often used Bruce's lyrics to quiz new people in his life to make sure they had their priorities straight. Also, golf geeks of a certain age all quote Caddyshack, and Tim was no different. Some of his favorite lines were, well, don't just stand there, get some glue, when everything would fall to hell. And he would also say, well, we're waiting, whenever he was waiting for someone to do something for him. And Tim always did his best to provide that line in the most exaggerated manner, just like Ted Knight. But what many of you do not know is what it's like to be in a relationship with Tim, because it's a very unique experience. In the days before cell phones and flat rate phone plans, I remember trying to find the cheapest phone rate so that we could talk on the phone. Tim would call at any hour, day, night, middle of the night, morning, wouldn't matter. It'd be before and after assignments. And it would always start with him calling me, and then halfway through, I would return the phone call. So we'd wind up splitting the cost between us. But somehow those arguments did not assuage my parents when the phone bill arrived. Did I mention those phone calls were to Africa? Oops. Thanks, Mom. Like I said, Tim and I have orbited around each other for a long time. And after dating for a few years, our relationship became difficult to maintain as Tim globetrotted and I finished college and graduate school. He moved to Africa for 5 years and began his own career, and I began my own, and we both lived our lives. I had heard Tim had gotten married and had children, but unfortunately, Tim's marriage did dissolve, but that was a stroke of luck for us. After 22 years of absolutely no contact, Tim wondered, whatever happened to Meredith? And that thought in 2016 spurred Tim to send a snail mail letter to my parents' home because he couldn't find me on the internet. And it arrived on the 23rd of December, and my parents hand delivered it on Christmas Eve. And I opened it and read it, and it was the best Christmas present I ever had. And hearing his voice for the first time in 22 years was the salve I did not know my heart needed. Tim, like every other person, was not perfect. And okay, we all know him. Tim was deeply flawed. He could be brash, egotistical, self-centered know-it-all, but disarming smile and charm would allow you to look over it all the time. As big as Tim's personality could be, I will cherish our quiet moments together the most. For me, the magic of Tim would come in that quiet smile that he would flash just for me, or the stolen glance he would give me from across the room, and any room it was, the kitchen, when I'm like in a ratty old t-shirt, he would just smile at me and make me feel like the most beautiful and loved person on the planet. Why am I sharing all of this? Because I have loved him for 33 years, and like many of you, I'm going to miss him deeply. But I realize how lucky I am that I got the chance to have my dream come to life. And I wish that for all of you. I'm so grateful that I got to hear his voice and feel his big bear hugs and just hold his hand while we would fall asleep. I would like to close with an excerpt from a book. The book is titled Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. I would recognize you in total darkness if you were mute and I were deaf. I would recognize you in another lifetime entirely, in different bodies and in different times. And I would love you in all of this until the very last star in the sky burnt out into oblivion. Tim, I love you with all of my heart, and thank you for all of the more.
Thank you, Meredith. As touching and profound as I thought it would be. I will need another water, hon. Can you just grab a bottle of water for me? 'Cause I'm gonna just keep rolling here. I've been sick since the day I heard about Tim through Eris. And not just physically. What? Oh, this picture, you didn't get to see that. You're like speaking. Hold on. Can we go back, Bill, a couple slides? That's one of him in his underwear early in our relationship. Just 2 slides, I think. God, not that one. One more. That. When I first met Tim, it was right over here, 4 blocks from here at Kingswood, Oxford. He was 16. I was closer in age to his parents than I was to Tim. And this, lanky guy in khaki pants and a powder blue shirt walked up to me and said, "You Brad Clift?" Like, I'm source of myth and legend. And I said, "Gee, just a complete asshole." I said, "All day long." And he looked at me like astonished and he laughed like, "Wow, that's funny. And here I thought you'd be a nice guy." And I'm like, here's a guy who was at Kingswood. And he said, "I heard you were just named photographer of the year." And I said, "Yes." He goes, that must be great. I was talking to Rich Messina at the New Britain Herald. That's Rich Messina, who finally became a photographer at the Current, started at the Herald. And some other guy, he was, Bill and Susan were encouraging him, "Well, go talk to these people." So he talked to somebody at the West Hartford News. And then he worked his way up. And this is going somewhere because he ends with James Noctway having lunch with him with his kids. But it started with somebody from the Hartford News, definitely Rich Messina, because Rich Messina told me this story. And he said, "So I sent him to you." I'm like, "Oh, thanks." So he says, I just been looking at your work in the paper, and they published a bunch of it in Northeast Magazine. And I just love your work. And because can we talk about it sometime? Could I come over to your house? I'm like, "God, no." Could I come over to the Current? I'm like, "Probably not." And we were totally full of ourselves. I mean, that Current had won more awards that year than any other paper, mostly for editing, but photography and design and pretty much everything. And I just thought, there he is. This is a couple years later, how thin he was, and I wasn't, and how brash he was and bold, all things that would serve him well. But at first I just thought, dude, you have better equipment than I do. And he did. He had a 300-2.8 when he was 16. And so I just thought, okay, I'm going to blow this guy off. And I said, "No, you don't want me. You want Bill Green up at Boston Globe. They're the best paper in all New England. They're one of the best papers in the country." In fact, I had just talked to Green, and they had been all over the country covering refugees. Great idea. He goes, "That's what I want to do." He's 16. 16, I was, wondering, who I was going to date next. And if people would sign my yearbook, I wasn't interested in worldwide stuff like that. And even then, I was a local photographer. It wasn't until I was asked to do the Day in the Life books from, I forget his name. But anyway, that's the problem with not using my notes. Yes. They invited me, and I started being interested in international then. But that's not what this is about. He goes up like the next week in his car and looks up Bill Green. And I know Bill Green. But it's not Bill Green who called me and said, "Why'd you send Tim up here?" He goes, Tim calls me. "Tim, remember me?" I'm like, "Yes, you're the guy at Kingswood." He goes, "With a great 302.8, And he said, "Yeah, Bill Green was mad at you." "Bill Green's mad at me." He said, "Yes, you sent him up here." And Bill Green blew me off. He said, "You don't want to talk to me." And by the way, I hate Brad Clift. Brad Clift was the first National Photographer of the Year in New England. We were supposed to do that. That year, Bill Green wins Photographer of the Year. They'll be damned if someone from the Hartford Current is going to beat them out. So what does he do? You're not talking to me. Well, first of all, Bill is more gruff than anybody. Bill sends him up the hall to talk to two-time Pulitzer Prize winner Stan Grossfeld. Stan Grossfeld does call me right after that. And he says, why don't you keep Tim Zielenbach in Connecticut? This kid is up here talking to me about, can I just look at portfolios? Can you look at his work? I said, I really said this. You can't keep Tim Zielenbach in Connecticut. And by the way, I'm not in charge of the guy. He's a teenager. Anyway, I tell this story because Tim, there's a reason he wound up at Contact. There's a reason he wound up being the best at what he did. He was driven, and there were no walls, and there were no barriers, and there was no egos. My God, there was my ego, and then there the egos that he encountered on the way up were amazing. And he would tell me. The great thing about Tim and my relationship, which started when he was 16 and I was 28, was that he could just say, and he did to you guys too, what exactly was on his mind about your photography or what you just did. You liked and admired him for what he was. I liked him for a lot of different reasons. We were not alike in any way, shape, or form, but that's what I liked about him. This guy had a moral compass that I had never seen. He really did. He really had this, I wouldn't call it a purity, but he certainly was like, well, that picture is set up and that picture is this. And he was very opinionated about all photographers. I never took him seriously those first few years. I just didn't. I couldn't. There's a guy who was, I had trouble with my own colleagues. I'm going to take a 16-year-old seriously. Well, he grew and he would call me. I feel like Ferris Bueller. It's like, he's just going to keep calling and calling and calling his friend Cameron. And I'm going to have to answer it. And I would have Post-it notes when I got back. And sometimes I'd be gone for a few weeks. Tim Z called. Zielenbach called. TZ called. I'm like, oh my God. And there were like a dozen of them. So here's this guy who's now 17. He said, the following year, I have been looking at your sports work and it needs work. He said that to me. And I'm like, okay. What kind of work? He said, well, why don't you come meet me in West Hartford? At the time, there was a place called Harry's Pizza. Well, yeah, it was the newer one on Farmington. Come talk to me. He goes, I've been collecting your clips this year in sports, and I got you beat on paper. Well, I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, you're going to enter PO Pictures of the Year, right? And I said, of course. He enters, and he wins like second place portfolio in sports in high school. So I think the guy who won first was Chris that year. Chris Asap? Yeah, so he was like an intern at the Current, but whatever the case, I looked at his work and it's like, actually, this is pretty good stuff. He had, he had a 302.8, but he got a great soccer shot between Avon and I think Kingswood, somebody. He used to just go to games over here, and he had a great shot in the rain. Degree of difficulty, like the only thing worse is fog or people shooting at you. And we'll get to that in just a second. I said, okay, well now, and he also, like I said, he used to have a way of dissing you that was actually complimentary. Like, I would be like, saying something like, gosh, you really look awful today, but you wear the greasy hair and the half goatee pretty good. And would say stuff like that to you and you go, are you serious? But it grew on me, is my point. Is that here's a guy, and I'm sure he did with whole, he just grew on me. And I remember him calling me and say, well, this is after we'd met for Harry's and looking at his work, and it was good. And here he was a junior now. A year later, 2088 or 1988, so last century. And he said, we really should, this is now another year later, said, the Berlin Wall's falling. You want to go? I think, I can't just go. How can you go? We'd gotten to know each other even better. And he would invite himself to my house all the time. So why don't we just, I know you got a big light table. I had a huge double one. And I would edit it and do slideshows and things at home. And he was always invited. And, he would like, it's too late to drive home. Can I stay overnight? And my wife would say, Tim can't stay, you buddies can't bunk up together tonight. Okay. She didn't understand the relationship we had. And the relationship we had it was one of mentor for many years. And he looked up to me and he would run things by me. But I was always like more sensitive to people. Tim was more brash. He was like, that picture you had on the front page, that 15 millimeter on the front page of the Current, that sucked. What were you thinking? I'm like, Tim, I don't want criticism from you. I'll tell you when I want criticism from you. And he goes, so that trip to the Berlin Wall is out. I'm like, yes, not going there. Next year, I don't know, it was the Gulf War. Going? No, I'm not going. He's now a student, I believe, at Indiana. So he does go to Africa, and against my advice, and he wanted to do the international thing, and he was good at photography. So why not? I got to the point where I trusted him completely with his opinion. I still didn't think he was mature enough to give me advice about marriage, love, money, cameras. I mean, he's shooting with Nikons. And by the way, one of those is a 24. Like this one here is like a 24. And this is when he was using Nikon before he knew that Nikon was no good. I mean, there was a period there when Canon was so much better. Anyway, now Nikon's back. He also taught me how to use Canon when I went to do wedding photography. And everything that Tim did from that point was really good, but he just kept ratcheting it up from, can we just go shoot a soccer game together at Avon Old Farms? Or can we just go over to, I heard that, Simsbury is really good and they're playing Farmington, who's also really good. And I said, yeah, they're like the number 1 and 2 ranked teams. He goes, yeah, but let's just go shoot it. And he, I don't know what you guys instilled in him, Bill and Susan, but the guy stuck to it and the guy wanted to learn and he was just a sponge. And I felt like the guy was cheating on me. I said, you're going up, talk to Grossfeld and you're not telling me about it. And you're down in New York, you're talking to people at Contact and you're not telling me, this is later in the 90s, but it's like, you're talking to Burnett. It's like, I thought we had something, important here. He goes, well, you can't teach me what they can teach me. And I'm like, oh my God, I thought I wanted to go further. So the following year, he would say, he's one of the things he said, because Tim and I almost came to blows many times. Most of you don't even know this, but we had almost like a marriage. It was, he would call me telepathically and say, you just got beat in POI. I said, Tim, the way I look at contests, you keep calling and saying you didn't win first. I said, well, it's like losing the Super Bowl. You know how far you had to get to win or lose that? And he'd say, well, photography is not as competitive as the Super Bowl. I said, you're right. It's way more. There's 100 people at every newspaper vying for those 10 jobs. There are 1,000 people vying for every job at Geograph, 1,000, and they're all good, And he'd say something like this, well, once the internet came along and he'd look at wedding photographers from Connecticut, there are 500. 50 are good, acceptable, and 5 are exceptional. Pick one, because you could make a mistake. They usually don't make mistakes with newspapers. They really had 100 portfolios for every position. So it was way more competitive. And what I taught him was you can never lose a photo competition. You can only win it. And that's the only way to look at it. If the only thing you did was live or die for contests, you would really be depressed most of the time because most people don't win Pulitzers and most people aren't photographers of the year. So I taught him some things, but he taught me way more than I ever taught him. And he taught me about life. Photography was secondary. By the time he called me, you were talking about what's the story. I taught him what's the headline. You can't do a story unless you know what the headline is. I know the headline and the picture is great. I know the story, and the picture story was exactly that thing. And that was my domain, or my expertise was picture stories. And one time he went back when you could go to the internet, and actually I left a couple of gems for him on the internet for him to find, and he found them. They're specifically for him. One of them was the illustrious Dr. Menga and his trusty dog. True story. He found it. It was for him only. The caption was from him, and he found it. In the same conversation, he said, you say here in your resume that you won 27 POI awards. I went back and looked. You had 23. I go, Tim, I didn't know, and this is like he was in high school. Yeah, I looked at your daily work, and then I like, were you sick or something? Really, we're like sick or something in October or November because your soccer stuff wasn't very good. And that's when he said, I got you beat on paper. Now he's 17. It's like so much more mature. Anyway, in 1992, he was in Africa. He said, I can get you into Somalia. And I'm going to go to Somalia. And I said, you're not going to go alone. He goes, yeah, I'm going up. I can get in through the World Food Program. Tim, this guy who I wouldn't even have pizza with in West Hartford, I wouldn't have to my house, who I pawned off on Stan, was now going to lead me to one of the most notorious places of all time. And it was amazing. He got me in. We were there for a month. We went in and out a couple times. We had to refresh, recoup, get more money. But before that, I wanted to show you this because this is in Somalia. And he's 20. I think he was 20. Yeah, 92. I think he was 20. Anyway, we would send each other flattering pictures of each other. This is the next one is one of them. This is how frustrated I felt being with him. That's really 90 caliber, and that was our car. And of course, I'm in the New York Times khaki pants and the blue shirt, which is Tim taught me. That's what you're supposed to wear when you're in the field out there. And by the way, Noctway and all those guys still wear that. Oh, is it? Okay. Well, I wore it in Somalia, which was really dumb. Anyway, in the next slide, I took a really flattering picture of him. And one more, next one, in his underwear, and sent to him as a postcard. And it got to him. You know what they did? They taped this part of it. Somebody put tape over his boxer shorts. Wow. I think more obscene things than that go through the mail. Anyway, and so he sent me back another nice picture in the next slide of, this wonderful thing that he had taken a picture of. And we can move on from that, but Tim is love. And there are pictures that we sent each other of each other that were destroyed by the post office. They never got there. 34, 20. And that's our technical vehicle. And Tim is like so full of life and what's the word? Just looking at the world like what could possibly go wrong. So this other teenager is driving us across from Mogadishu to Baidoa because we'd heard that things were really bad there. There are only 100 dying a day, and the civil war was still going on in Mogadishu. But out in Baidoa, it might be better. It might be less dangerous. 200 people a day dying in August and September of 1992. It's the reason we went. Underneath his feet, after we got, like 800 miles down the road. No, it's not that far. 300 miles down the road. It was an 8-hour drive across a minefield. And, God, he's like, it's a good thing we couldn't talk to anybody at home. See, how are things going today? Well, I mean, I'm sure Tim wouldn't say. I would never have told my the woman I was with then what we were facing every day. But Tim, every night, would lay down in these cots were incredibly uncomfortable and say almost, it's not even a prayer, but a mantra about, God, I'm glad to be here. And I'm like, only a missionary would say that. It's like somebody in the 1500s down in the rainforest thing. So glad we did the river today. And gee, it's too bad we lost those nuns down in the waterfall. But he just had this positive attitude and it rubbed off on me because, man, he looked at like I looked at the world as going to hell in a handbasket, and he looked like, no, man, this just is a story that needs to be told, you know. And so, what's the headline, Tim? I said, and he said, it's hell on earth. And I said, well, we got to cover that, but I kind of promised your dad to try to help bring you back alive. You know, it was really important to get back. We get to the end of this place in Baidoa, and there had been a rocket propelled grenade launcher shell, live one, bouncing under his chair. You know, it's like your dad, you're like going on a trip, and he's like, well, who's hitting my chair? Or what is that bouncing? And he kept saying that because little things annoyed him. What is that bouncing against my feet? And it's a live round, you know, rocket propelled grenade shell ready for launching. Anyway, the crux of this is that everybody thinks, you know, and even my colleagues at the paper, why did you take him on? And I'm like, he just grew on you. I mean, he grew on you. He grew on you. There's, you know, the only way to play is to say it. And like I said, when the times when we almost came to blow, one time I swung and missed at him, and I forget what that was for, but it was something of, oh, it's here. And it was in my notes here. I said to him, what are you doing here? Because I was writing this piece as well as photographing it. Because nobody from the LA Times was going, the paper owned us, and no one from any of the big papers were going. They're all covering the Andrew, the conventions, the Olympics, and the Olympics and the election won the Pulitzers that year. He said, well, I'm kind of chasing a Pulitzer, and so are you. And I'm like, I'm not. I'm here to tell a story. I don't know what you're doing here. And he said, well, you know, you're trying to win one too. And I'm like, I'm not. It's like a scene from a movie because you're like these two guys who are from different places. But I literally took a swing at him. And I hate to say this, but the fact of the matter is we were both too drunk to do any damage to each other. And one of the ways we got through this was to be close. But also I was suspicious of his youth, but his youth is what saved me. His vim and vigor was so contagious that I couldn't see all the death and destruction around us without looking at him, knowing it's like, you know, he used to actually say, oh, with no offense to you, Bill, oh, Dad, but he'd do it sarcastically. Oh, Dad, I'm not going to do that. And at first I felt like I was more of a father figure, a brother figure than I was an equal. By the end, I mean, Tim had far surpassed me as far as weddings and documenting things. So I just, those early days are important because they set the ground for us. Once you go to war or you've gone to ground zero, which we did together, once you've been to really horrible places, there's a bond. And Tim could call me up and say, what's that? Of a story like you were saying, you know, there's this, or like you were saying, Patrick, watching something on TV. Well, what's the headline of that? And we would know, and we would know the image. And he was so good at knowing those things. And encyclopedic. He was encyclopedic about my work. You know, why'd you do that? Why'd you do that? Because he wanted to sop up the knowledge and use it somewhere. He wanted to take that and work on it. I took some of my philosophy from John White because I was in Illinois when I was young and impressionable. And I didn't instill it. I told it to Tim. And he goes, we disagreed about this. He said moment was the most important thing. And I said, God, it's like, it's important. But I have seen pictures like from Salgado or Noctway where there's no moment at all. There's this unbelievable light. There's this unbelievable composition. I'm looking through that picture like a Salgado's, where there's so much depth. It's the one in the gold mine where there's this guy crawling up the stairs, and you realize the dots that are down there 500 yards below in the dirt and the mud are people, and there are thousands of them. They're digging for gold in the 20th century. And he goes, and I said, that picture, that's not a, it's composition. And it was raining. Salgado tells the story. He did it at Yale. The composition, that he climbed up the ladder in front of that guy, and it's raining. He's got 3 cameras, none of them below a 50 though. Actually, that one was probably a 35, but whatever the case. It's such a phenomenal shot. And we were both so turned on by it. We just thought, it's amazing. It is composition. I said, yeah, but light. Look at some pictures too that Salgado takes, or Noctway, or any of the other people. There are thousands of great photographers, but you could look at them like you could look at them in like their Louvre. They're so fantastic. I got to take a drink real quick. And what's the time? So I'm only going to be a couple more minutes. I know I spent a lot of time with the early days, but that was the foundation, especially Somalia. He was no longer my mentor. I was no longer his mentor. He was equal, man. And by the way, when I worked with him down south on weddings or bar mitzvahs or whatever, corporate events, whatever we did, he would never introduce me as an assistant. Always introduce me as a colleague, and always say really nice things about me. He was robbed for a Pulitzer, or he was photographer of the year once, or something that people give a crap about anyway. But you're lugging 8 cameras and 40 stands, and you go, yeah, I'm not an assistant at all. I'm just here having fun. And when you're like, okay, today's shoot is 3. We don't even have to shoot this. This is just people getting together. And he could enter a room and do the room. He could actually get hugging everybody. He was like, I'm a wasp. I don't hug people. I'm like, we since the Mayflower, we don't really hug. So, he just taught me so much about people and life. And, I'm sure I taught him lots of things not to be. But we were both crass. Maybe when we finally got out of here, and I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings about this, but there was one time when Tim did something really wrong there, and I wrote about it, and he said, yeah, you got it just right, but we got shot at by machine guns, and he cried. And it's not weakness at all, because it's the scariest thing I've ever been at until Sudan. But that night, we got kicked out of the aid agency we were at, and none. It's not supposed to be funny. It is now that we survived it, but gave me 4 Valium. I'm walking across the street because they say you can't stay here anymore. Those guys are coming back for you later tonight, which is unbelievably frightening. Guys with machine guns who don't like us are going to come back and shoot us in the night. And our guards are gone, because our guards, different families. And he's like, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I'm like, on the way across back to the compound we were at, which was a maze of places where we were hiding that night, I dropped 2 of them. And I feel like, Moses coming down from the, mountain, and had 15 commandments, and he drops one of the tablets and 2. So he said, well, were you able to get something from the nuns? I go, yes. We can never go back there. They're really pissed that their compound had bullets in its walls now because of us. It wasn't just him. I did kind of the same thing. I just didn't get caught. He photographed a technical, which you were not supposed to do that then, because they kill you. Anyway, he said, did her name escapes me, but I think it was Nurse Nina. Anyway, it doesn't matter her name, very kind woman, and said, we have trouble sleeping here too. Here's 4 Valium. I presented Tim with 2. Anyway, through the night, what I saw in him was someone who cared so much, someone who was so vested in our world, someone who loved the world so completely that he was willing to risk just out of his teens to go do this. And so when I left the Hartford Current, someone said to me, yeah, we're parting ways with you because of your character. And the only thing I could say is, and it came from Tim, my character's intact. I've been around the world risking my life for stories that matter. And not even that, trying to capture life. And like I said to Tim, the light, it's not just moment and composition. It's also, there are pictures that are meaningful to other people that have no meaning in the big picture. Well, he wanted to do the big picture. And I don't blame him because I wanted to do it too. And he inspired me. And he was something to behold because what he did was he gave himself in every situation to everybody else. I'm not sure, and again, I'm baffled by his death too. I'm not sure that there was enough left for Tim, but I don't know. I thought I knew him really well, and yet here we are. And I'm very sorrowful about the end of his life, but there's so much more important things that he brought. And we can keep going with the pictures. I'm stuck on this one forever, but we can go ahead, Bill, and keep going through because there's more that should have been the background of this. And by the way, he sent me just before or just after, I'm sorry, I can't remember. Is this it? Well, that's his writing. And he always had a little note that was kind of funny from the desk of Zielenbach. Brad, I'm sending you the Lono flag. Had the one of the aid agencies make for us. I think it was blurred vision, he used to call it. By the way, he never called anything what it was. It was always like, some funny takeoff of something. This was it, Lono. We flew it on our Jeep, and people would say, oh, here comes the aid agency Lono. Because they didn't want to admit they didn't know, well, who was Lono? I think it's the god of debauchery and excess. Well, yeah, excess, yes, access, not excess, not access. Anyway, sunny days in Kenya, and before we went in, and then we'll just keep going through these. Tim, here I am, you're really shooting for the LA Times and the Hartford Current and Baltimore Sun, the 3 papers that use my work and my writing. And he got us, he goes, oh, there's another picture, go to the next one. Yeah, he's on the phone. This is the Pakistani group that was keeping the peace in Mogadishu. He got us on the phone with the admiral of the USS Tarawa. Yeah, can we come out? We're just a couple journalists from the United States. And of course, he was freelance. Actually, was he in Indiana at the time? He might have gone back to Indiana. Okay, all right. I think his pictures were used there. Anyway, so we fly out to the USS Tarawa because it's him. We're in Mogadishu because it's him. Not me, not a guy with 15 years experience. It's Tim, the 20-year-old. So, I think brash or being bold is a bad thing. It's what moves the world. What I'm here to tell you is he moved not only the world, he moved my world, and he moved our world. And I love him for it. And he grew on me every day. And we can keep going. Getting on the plane. And you know what he did? And you guys will know this. Anybody who knows him knows this. I want to interview well, first of all, we go down to the bowels of the Tarawa, based on a great, battle in World War II. It's an aircraft carrier, and there are 500 Marines working out in the bowels of this thing. And we want to start shooting pictures, of course. And they got no pictures down here. And these guys were like, where did you get these guys? And I'm like, God, I'm glad they're on our side. Because we talked to the admiral who first told me a great big 30-minute lesson about Vietnam and the problem with photographers. And I didn't know it then, but now we all know it. Yeah, wait till you guys hit the shore in Mogadishu and see what that's like. Because we're guys in shorts, which in the Muslim world, if you're wearing shorts as a man, no. So they come ashore with cameras, TV cameras, lighting up the Marines coming to shore. Anyway, that's the question I asked the guy, and he after the lecture about Vietnam said our plans are to keep it sovereign. 2 days later, he gets us into see the guy they're looking for in Black Hawk Down, Mohammed Farah Adid. He gets us in to see him. It's just us two, a guy from the Guardian, and we're talking, and Tim is shooting his ring. He's got a giant ring, and he notices it. I'm like, oh shit. So he calls in his assistants. I thought he was going to take his film, but he was like a lot of dictators, really great showman, and really nice guy. Anyway, we can keep going. The reason that Somalia is so important is because it was Tim, a 20-year-old, who got us into all those places and got us into the very place where Black Hawk Down happened a year before it happened. In fact, when I was vetted at the Coast Guard Academy, which is run by Homeland Security, they said, you're really hard to vet. And I said, well, why? Well, because you were in Tiananmen Square, Somalia, Iraq, Russia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, before all these things happened. I said, I'm a journalist. I don't work for the agency at all. You know, when you get caught by these people, as I did in Sudan, they assume you're a spy because in a way you're collecting information that you actually then give to other people, and then they make decisions about that. When we got out of Somalia, finally got to a hotel, Tim had some money taken from him. He also won a bunch of money at one of the casinos. He was a little sparse on cash, and so we got a really nice hotel, like the nicest you could get. The only reason I bring up that Tim cried in Somalia is because when we got out for 3 days, I couldn't stop. There was so many things, and even now, can't even talk about what we saw because what you photograph and what you see are so different. Because there's things you can't shoot, and there's things you don't shoot. Tim went out one day, and he showed me another day what he shot, and what was he shooting? He wasn't shooting a moment. They were bathing a body. In Islam, they bury, I think it's within, is it 24 hours? Okay. Start bathing the body of a young boy. And the only thing you could really see in the room, even though it was really colorful, was the light on the boy's face as they poured this water from these metal canteens over him. And only he saw that. In 91, I'm going to try to get out of the 90s real quick here. In 91, he and his grandfather went to Ireland, and he calls me. He goes, I happen to be in Ireland. He goes, can I assist you? Because it's a day in the life of Ireland. I go, because back then it was like the guy with the head against the 90 caliber. I was like, oh man, he assisted me, and it made it so much better. The other thing that's really important about that is, while I kept talking about the light instead of moment, he was shooting the light in Somalia, and he was shooting the light at this dog race, a simple dog race in Ireland, where all the faces are ruddy and great with the hats. Just great look. I'm shooting that. And he would say, why are you shooting that when there's this? I turn around. It's late afternoon. The shadows of the, I forget what they were. The dog racers were all being cast against the wall behind it, which was all like in a color of a rainbow. And they're all, the greyhounds, they're all gray. And I said, how do you see that? Well, that's everything. Moment, it's seeing. We can keep going. Sorry, this is later years, but you know, when I got back from India, I think it was, Tim was there. Tim just always showed up like he did over here. He'd show up at my house. He'd show up at the Current. He'd just show up. But he always had this knack. It's like, talk about being in the right place at the right time. For me, I never really thought I was there for him. He was always there for me. This is a man who, after I had been captured, tortured, yeah, I could say it, and survived because Chris Dodd got me out of Sudan through the UN. First call was Tim. Tim called and said, "Are you okay?" I said, I'm about 1,000 miles from okay, you know. And then I was acting weird. And so, and the paper didn't help me. You know, you wanted to be a big deal. You went over there and, you know, try to be Lawrence of Arabia. No. That's so, you know, the other thing is you think you can handle all situations, especially I did Somalia, I did Russia, I did all this. Tim would be very humble. He's like, you don't know what your next gig's going to be. And he always rescued me. I thought I rescued him. I'm here to tell you today, he rescued me, and many times gave me the shirt off my back when I left the paper. You know, I've been in the business for 25 years. Tim rescued me. I didn't want him to. I didn't want him to be I didn't want to be his friend. He was so different from me, you know, but he also, I never laughed with a friend as much as I laughed with him, and I could make him laugh too, you know, mostly because of the absurdities. But, you know, trying to go do something great with photography, and it didn't work. And for the first time in my life, it didn't work. But the person who was there that day when I got back goes, well, you know, certainly CNN and other people have called you. And I said, yeah, no, they didn't. I said, wow, that's weird. I said, yeah, the only person who called me is you. And he said, so how are you doing? And it's not well. Come down here. I did. I'll come down to Savannah. I'll teach you the business. I won't say the profanity, but like them, you know, there's only so much currency in any business. And at the Current, your currency was out. Plus, the business is changing. I said, what do you mean? He could see, prognosticate things. He could predict things better than anybody I knew, which is half our business. If like you knew you needed to be, you know, you're going to need to be in Ukraine, you go to Ukraine. You're going to need to be in Israel. And he wanted to do that stuff. But in the end, the person who, you know, I thought I saved me multiple times. And so we kept, as we got older and had kids, searching for the light, searching for the moment, searching for great pictures, but searching for ways to use our vision that was satisfying to me. And I think Tim found that. Talk about working. My God. You know, I'd feel great if I gave somebody 8 hours. We often gave people 16 hours at a wedding. We shut the place down. We were there after the roadies left. We were there. You know, there might be, you know, the shot. Well, they're gonna come out at some point. You know, I'm gonna go get the rose petals leading up to the bridal suite. And I said, don't knock on the door. But he knew people well enough to do that. I mean, you'd be invited into anything. So, he literally, Tim is a guy who would give you a shirt off his back, and he did with me. We can keep going with the slides, Bill. Sorry, I'm lagging behind. But no, he loved his kids. He loved Meredith. He told me so. And he showed it. And all I kept doing was trying to find him and seek joy in a moment in time, a moment with our heirs, a moment with our kids, a moment of purity. He spoke at my wedding. He comforted you while I spoke about photography and love. These are all of our comrades in arms at the wedding. And we can keep going. And then one day, we can slow it down just a bit, but one day, not too long ago, you can take it easy. Hang on. We went for a hike. It was Father's Day about 10 years ago. And we finally found what everybody's looking for. We really are. It's that moment in the sun where we taught him to hike, And we can go to the next one. And fish. Caught his first fish on the lake that day. You can just keep going, Bill. There it is. Guys on the bench. After the swim, after the fishing. And then, you know, this shot here. There's that sun. That's not a moment. That's not composition. It's fatherhood and love. Next shot, next one. Just wet grass under your feet. Summer sun on your face. Trying to capture a moment. But now live in the moment. What a happy day. And hold it right there for a minute. Because that kind of happiness is elusive, but we had it. And it shines like there. In my heart, Tim will always shine. Always. Through every image he took. And not through the big ones, the little ones like this. That break my heart that he's gone. You can go to the next one. Every day, I pass that picture of us getting married. It's not light or composition or moment. It's just time. It's so elusive, and he captured it. And the next one. My son, 8 years old, flying through the air here in West Hartford. You might remember it, Bill. Here's another one where he's on my back and we're 4 feet in the air, snow's flying. I'm forever grateful that he did what photography does. He stopped time and gave his heart and soul to people who would appreciate a picture like that. I pass it every day, and every day I'll see Zielenbach and I'll remember Tim every day. That's all I have to say. So glad I got to know him. Anybody else want to say anything? Okay. We have refreshments in the back. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Wow.
Would you know my name if I saw you in heaven? Would it be the same if I saw you in heaven? I must be strong and carry on, 'cause I know there.